Good morning, everyone. Today I would like to talk about the case of the Freeway killers. I will give a little context before, then we will analyze each of them separately, then we will see the similarities and differences between them. Afterwards, we will understand why police forces thought that it was just one killer and how they discovered the truth, and in conclusion, there will be some final reflection. To give a little background, we can say that it was the early 1970s and that along the highway of the Southern California, dozens of young men, mostly homosexual, were found brutally murdered. Initially, police believed these crimes were the work of a single sadistic killer who was targeting the gay community. But later, investigators realized that three separate serial killers were acting independently, all operating in the same area and period, and they were Patrick Kearney, William Bonin, and Randy Kraft. Patrick Kearney will be the first killer that we will analyze. He was nicknamed the Trashbag Killer, and we will understand why later. He was born in 1939 in an apparently stable family. He was thin, fragile, and often heel, so he was mocked and bullied by his classmates, who called him queer. He started to develop fantasies of revenge against his aggressors, and at 13 he began practicing bestiality, showing early signs of violence and deviant sexuality. He was described as quiet, introverted, and polite, but these traits were just masking his deep psychological disturbance. His modus operandi was to abduct hitchhikers or young gay men met in bars or on the street. He then shot them in the head inside his car, and after killing them, he engaged in sexual act with the corpse, dismembered it, and placing the remains in plastic trash bag, which he abandoned along highways, hence the nickname. The choice of the victims was not random. They were often handsome, athletic young men, the very same figures who, as a boy, may have represented bullies or unattainable male role models for him. In other cases, however, he targeted teenagers or younger boys in a sick attempt to exercise the control he had always lacked as a young man. His victims were often lonely boys looking for a lift or company, and therefore easy to manipulate. This shows a clear opportunistic component. The fact that the violence continued post-mortem and that the bodies were mutilated and discarded like rubbish indicates a clear desire to degrade the others, as if he were symbolically removing those who had made him feel inferior in the past. Murder, sexual acts with corpses, and dismemberment became for him extreme forms of power, revenge, and emotional cleansing. Patrick Kearney was the first killer to be discovered. When he turned himself in to the police in 1977, he made a deal. He gave a full confession of all his victims in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. His confession led investigators to victims who had not been discovered previously, but he could not have been responsible for all the other unsolved murders the police had on their hands. And this is because there was another killer working in the same area with a similar MO. He was William Bonin, born in 1947 into a deeply dysfunctional family. His father was a violent alcoholic and his mother was distant and neglectful. During his childhood, he was often placed in children's homes, where he suffered physical and sexual abuse from other children and adult staff. During adolescence, he showed increasing signs of instability. He had difficulty relating to his peers and alternated between being a victim and a bully. He began to exhibit violent and sadistic sexual fantasies and inflicted cruelty on animals. He was impulsive, manipulative, and unable to handle frustration. He developed deviant sexual behaviors, which led him to commit assault and abuse against minors. He was therefore arrested and imprisoned several times, but was always released on probation. He underwent psychiatrist evaluation that revealed an antisocial personality disorder with strong impulsive and sadistic traits. He was also diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a marked inclination towards paraphilia. He exhibited compulsive and bizarre sexual behavior, which included elements of sadism, necrophilia, and a total lack of remorse. He also reported severe difficulty controlling his impulses, particularly in situations of sexual arousal and anger. His modus operandi was to kidnap teenagers or young adults, mostly hitchhikers or street kids, with his van. He would then tie them up with ropes or handcuffs, rape them repeatedly, torture them with bites, punches, burns on instrument, and then strangle them. After killing them, he would sometimes commit acts of necrophilia. And then he abandoned the bodies along the motorways of Southern California. He exhibits a prevalence of organized serial killer traits because he planned the luring and the transport of victims. He had a prepared vehicle and he attempted to eliminate traces. Also, he did not always act alone. He involved at least four accomplices, all vulnerable or impressionable young men, who actively participated in the murders. He exploited their psychological fragility or desire for approval to involve them in their crimes, creating a climate of violent codependency. Law enforcement struggled to connect the cases due to the variety of victims and their geographical dispersion. However, the arrest of one of the accomplices led to a key piece of evidence. The police therefore were able to place Bonin under surveillance, and on the 11th of June 1980 he was arrested in the act while attempting to assault a young man in his van. After his arrest, Bonin openly confessed to numerous murders, describing them with coldness and detachment. He explained that he was unable to control his impulses and that he felt pleasure doing the acts. He showed no remorse for the victim, and during the trial he pleaded guilty to 13 murders. However, there were still open cases of young men murdered in the Southern California region that showed a slightly different modus operandi. In fact, neither Kearney nor Bonin had given their victims alcohol or drugs, because that was the work of Randy Kraft. He was born in 1945 in a stable family. He was described as intelligent and precocious. During his college years, he began to explore his homosexuality, going to gay clubs and getting into relationships with men. He then came out to his family and later to his Air Force superiors, but he received a general discharge for medical reasons, and these events may have contributed to a sense of alienation and internal conflict. He was outwardly normal. In fact, he worked as a computer programmer and had a long-term partner. But inside he was a stone-cold killer. In fact, his modus operandi was to lure young men, often soldiers or hitchhikers, by offering them rides, alcohol, or drugs. He then gave them sedatives to make his victims unconscious. He then tied up the victims, tortured them, and killed them by strangulation, asphyxiation, or overdose. Then the bodies were abandoned along motorways or in isolated areas. Kraft used alcohol and sedatives such as Valium both personally and to drug his victims. His behavior suggests traits of obsessive-compulsive personality disorder with a strong need for control and ritualization, as well as narcissistic and sadistic characteristics. Some victims even show signs of necrophilia, indicating extreme paraphilias and a total lack of empathy. Kraft fits squarely into the category of organized killer because he carefully selected his victims, he planned his attacks with precision, and he avoided leaving traces, moving the bodies to remote areas. Unlike Bonin, Kraft sought pleasure not only in violence itself, but also in precision and control of the scene. In some cases, victims were drugged and tortured for hours, demonstrating a desire to maximize suffering and prolong domination. Kraft also presents one of the most sophisticated forms of functional psychopathy, because he maintained an intact social image. In fact, he lived with a long-term partner, he was working regularly and was described as normal by his colleagues, he was polite, cultured, and capable of social interaction. This placed him in the profile of the integrated serial killer, capable of leading a double life, publicly functional, privately predatory. One of the most unusual elements of the Kraft case is his scorecard, a list of his victims. The list, written in code, suggests an obsessive memory of the murders, a sense of ownership over the victims, and a desire to catalogue the violence, almost like a collection. The presence of the list indicates an attempt to immortalize control to give a name, also coded, to each prey, as if each represented a trophy. And this behavior is consistent with ritualistic serial killers, who fetishizes their own criminal action. Now I would like to highlight similarities and differences between the three of them. We can see that the period and number of victims was similar, as well as the fact that the necrophilia was present in each of them, but the method and the signature was different. For example, Kearney liked to shoot and dismember his victims, while Bonin preferred to torture and strangulate them, and Kraft to drug them and torture them. Also, trash bags was the signature of Kearney, while Bonin's signatures were strangulation and burns. Also, Bonin was the only one who ever had accomplices. Then why did police forces believe that it was only one killer who was working all this time? Well, because there were similarities between the victims. In fact, they were predominantly young men, often hitchhikers or marginalized individuals, often homosexual. The method of abandoning of the bodies was similar, because they were discovered near motorways, suggesting a common modus operandi. Also, there were common elements such as sexual violence, post-mortem mutilation, and the apparent lack of links between the victims, and also the geographical area was the same. Then, the media and public perception had a crucial role, because the media helped to consolidate the idea of a single killer, using the epithet "Freeway killer", which reinforced this belief in public opinion. But then, how did they realize that there was three separate killers? They analyzed more in depth the differences in modus operandi, and this revealed significant differences in the method used to kill and treat the victims. Also, the suspects' confessions and forensic evidence such as fibers found on the bodies and DNA traces helped to distinguish between the different killers. Also, when Kearney turned himself in 1977 and confessed to many murders, several cases remained unsolved and the methods did not match his. Also, the arrest of Bonin in 1980s was a key turning point. The Freeway killer case highlights how dangerous it can be to hypothesize patterns without thorough forensic and behavioral analysis. To the authorities at the time, we can criticize that they made assumptions based on superficial similarities. The authorities, in fact, focused on obvious similarities between the cases, overlooking significant differences in modus operandi and signatures. They also relied too heavily on visual and environmental similarities without thoroughly analyzing behavioral and forensic differences. This slowed down the investigation and created an investigative illusion, that of a single perpetrator. Also, law enforcement agencies often operated in isolation without sharing crucial information, which delayed the identification of the killers. Today, this case can teach us the importance of behavioral profiling because it shows that studying the killer's behavior in depth, so not only where he leaves the body, but how he kills, what he does before and after, is essential for distinguishing between different individuals. In fact, the psychological profiles of Kearney, Bonin, and Kraft were distinctly different, and recognizing this made it possible to separate them. It can also teach us the importance of a scientific, open, and flexible approach to the investigation, because when investigators decide too early what to believe, they may ignore contradictory data. And also, it highlights the need for collaboration and technology. Today, thanks to centralized databases such as SpyCap and advanced forensic analysis techniques, it is easier to identify different serial killers even if they operate in the same territory. So, to conclude, we can say that this case highlights the importance of networking, sharing information, and updating investigative techniques. Thank you for your attention.